Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Build Better Release Management. As we wait on a few more people to get themselves logged in, I'm going to go ahead and launch a quick poll just to get a sense of where everybody's at. If you could let us know kind of why you're here and the biggest challenges you have. We ran out of options in the GoToWebinar, so if you've got an option that doesn't fit with one of these, go ahead and throw your response in the questions also. All right, so looks like majority of people here today are struggling with those promoting changes between orgs, some interest in version control, backlog also an issue. Good news is we're going to address all of these things and give you some tools and best practices to help alleviate some of those challenges. So let's get into it here. I am Haley Coxon. I am VP of Marketing at Prodly, and I am thrilled to be joined by two of our wonderful customers at SPS Commerce, Tara and Cullen. Would you guys like to introduce yourself and your roles and kind of your experience with release management?
Sure. So I am the manager of the CPQ team at SPS. I was actually the founding member of the first ever CPQ admin at Salesforce or at SPS Commerce. And so we've built the team in CPQ and our release management, strategy all in the last 3 years. So it's definitely a process. We've come a long way, and excited to be here and share our experience with you.
And Cullen?
I'm a business systems admin with SPS, and I've been here for a little over a year. And in that time, I've taken on a role of not only building the enhancements that we are building in our CPQ environment, but also I've taken on the deployment role of moving a lot of those things, organizing our deployment windows, and onboarding Prodly as a tool to keep the release cycles going.
Awesome. So you live this day in and day out.
I do.
We're also joined by Max Rudman, Prodly CEO. Max, would you like to tell the audience hello?
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. Just as a quick introduction, so Max Rudman, formerly founder of Steelbrick, which became Salesforce CPQ, and our challenges with release management of CPQ projects is actually what given us the idea to start Prodly. And so as I like to joke with my second company, I'm solving the problems I created with my first.
Well, we're glad you are, because it's keeping all of us employed. So a few housekeeping items and takeaways. Attendees are on mute, but we want to hear from you. So if you have questions, please enter them in the questions box. We will be taking them as we get them, and we'll have time at the end as well. So I think 3 core things to take away. There's very significant benefits of release management. We'll get into those and how to position release management as a strategy for your organization. Different methodologies, pros and cons, how to evaluate what might be right for you as a company and a team, and then some best practices that pretty much anybody can implement regardless of what methodology you go into. So why release management? Max, these are some pretty big claims: velocity, collaboration, risk reduction. How does release management impact all of these things, and kind of what is the impact and benefit?
Yeah, sure. So velocity, is obviously important, right? We talk a lot, certainly in Salesforce ecosystem, around digital transformation and being more responsive to your customers. And what that means for the teams that own business systems is going faster. right? Adapting faster to the changes that are demanded by business and the marketplace and our customers. And so being able to execute on change requests faster is a key component of that. And a robust release management process, a robust change management process makes it possible. It's the oil that greases the wheels of that engine.
Mhm.
And collaboration is obviously also very important, right? So not only do you want to make changes fast, you want to make the right kind of changes, and you want to have the right team in place executing the changes. So a proper change management, release management process really fosters that collaboration and engages ideally a cross-functional team, right? So IT, admins, as well as business users or people who represent business users, like operations, sales ops, or revenue ops, or whatever. And finally, you want to go fast, but you don't want to break things, right? So most organizations have governance processes in place exactly for that reason, to ensure that that you're not damaging and not breaking things as you go fast. So risk mitigation is obviously another key component of a robust release management process, to really put those guardrails around and make sure that you're delivering value and not introducing unnecessary risk and jeopardizing the business in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all of these things kind of come together and coalesce as you get better at release management and more diligent processes. Tara, can you share from your perspective in SPS Commerce, how has release management impacted your team and your business?
Yeah, really, it's been a total game changer, and it was a requirement that we intentionally spent time developing a better release management strategy. Our team sits as the funnel for so many parts of our organization, from finance to product management, sales, and sales operations, and being able to organize our work, speak to our delivery dates, and iterate with our customers has really allowed us to become better business partners and gain stability on the team, increase productivity, and we are a lot faster for having those processes in place. So our team has grown leaps and bounds just by implementing that release strategy.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic to hear. Cullen, I know you are more kind of boots on the ground. You're interacting with a lot of other teams that also manage Salesforce. And we've talked in the past about, velocity is both, not just the being able to deploy faster, but what can you tackle next, or what can you start to work on next? And you've got some interesting kind of stories about how your team and your teammates have been able to take on work that maybe wouldn't have been prioritized, but that has been really impactful for the business. If you could share that story with the audience, I think that would be great.
Yeah, so if you think about sort of the buckets of work we experience, we've got our corporate initiatives, we've got our CPQ team initiatives, and then we have sort of individual goal work. And oftentimes the third is the most frequent loser, and the second, the priorities are very obvious there. And getting faster with our deployment cycles have reduced the time we spend on those corporate initiatives, which are necessary and important, obviously, and freed us up to do more team enhancements and personal goal work, which is the really exciting work, the really engaging work you get to do. And one recent example is, with the time freed up from better deployment windows, we were able to, members of our team were able to work with contract managers or administrators who were having really painful experiences with payment plans, with sort of billing nuances, and we were able to build a solution for them, get it live, tested, validated, deployed. And without those faster deployment windows, I'm not sure we'd even be scoping it right now. But today it's been active for months and enhanced a couple times, and those sorts of quality of life improvements that we can provide for teams that we collaborate with are, something that gets really exciting.
And it just fosters that better collaboration as well, because you're now able to take a step back and like, okay, what's most painful? What can we help you solve? What can we work together on? Which is great. So we have some specific results from SPS. I'll throw it to Tara or Cullen. How, and we've talked a little bit, but can you expand on how having Prodly, having a better release management has kind of shifted your team's focus and kind of your team's perception within the broader organization?
Yeah, I'll build on what Cullen just mentioned, which is that it has allowed us to become more innovative and to lead in terms of development, as opposed to being solely reactive and responsive to our customers' requests. And with that shift, it has increased our buy-in and adoption with CPQ, and has opened the door for our business partners to seek us out when they're looking at changes, new products, etc., starting with us and asking, how should we best accomplish this, and what are your thoughts? And so we've really become a trusted advisor in the organization because we've been able to spend time getting ahead.
I think far too often admins fall in this trap of there's so much work that it becomes very much an order taking kind of reactive, where administrators, Salesforce admins get into it because they see the power of the platform and they want to make magic happen for their users, and it's kind of, you get bogged down over time by just the volume of things that need to be fixed or changed. And so it's really awesome to me that release management and having better practices can help kind of lift you out of the, oh crap, just I have to keep up with everything that's coming my way, and I can actually be proactive. I can bring my ideas and innovation to the company to make it better versus just reaction. Cullen, release frequency. So you guys you've had some pretty dramatic improvement here. You've cut your release frequency in half. Can you just say a little bit more about how you were able to do that, what that process was like? Obviously, it wasn't just a magic wave with a wand, and you went from pushing out changes monthly to weekly. But what did that look like for you guys?
I think having a more predictable release management cycle allowed us to get better at how we planned our sprints. There wasn't this sort of nebulous, who knows how long this deployment's going to take, if we hit snags or if we have to manually do these steps. Now that we know that, hey, we'll turn off triggers before business hours on Thursday, and we'll push everything and it'll be done by the time the day starts, then it's only going to take, however you structure your sprints. For us, it's points. We know that's 1 point. So we're able to really accurately plan our sprints with a known quantity in our deployment windows. So then we can bring in that more engaging work, and we can have release days on a weekly basis. We can have testing tickets to follow up on those releases, and everything becomes structured and predictable in a way that frees us up to do exciting things.
Mm-hmm. And you hit on the kick it off overnight and kind of this last section of deployment time, because you're not having to sit there and watch the deployment go. You're not having to wait and then load the next file in data loader. It's been a big impact for you, correct?
Yeah, it's incredible to not have to be spending early mornings, late nights, or weekends doing sequences of spreadsheet deployments because you're relying on data from the previous deployment to make sure the next one, all of that manual sequencing is taken care of. So the kick it off, go to bed, wake up, see the results, see the successes, see any issues that need to be addressed. It offers a peace of mind and a quality of life boost that I think we're all enjoying. That's
great. Yeah. No one wants to be moving spreadsheets around on their nights and weekends, that's for sure.
No.
All right, so we're going to transition a bit here and talk about some different release methodologies. obviously, when we're talking about release management, at the core, it's just how do you take an idea for a new change through, full cycle to actually deploying it for your users and getting it into their hands. And so Max, there's several different ways we could do this. Some of these are kind of borrowed methodologies from more traditional software development. Can you take us through kind of these different types, one-off changes, waterfall, agile methodologies? Tell us a little bit about kind of the characteristics of each of those, and is it necessarily an evolution? Do you have to start at one and end up with the other, or how does that work?
Yeah, thanks, Haley. So these are the three kind of common models that we see, and sort of one-off changes. I mean, you can also maybe say it's no methodology at all, which is also all too common, unfortunately, especially in kind of the early stage companies, so maybe just starting with Salesforce or small. So with one-offs, as we call them here, sometimes you're making changes directly in production, which is obviously bad. Best case, maybe you have your full sandbox and everybody kind of works there, and then you sort of randomly promoting changes, from sandbox to production, hopefully using some automation. Sometimes you're just load sharing, particularly with config data, and maybe just rekeying some of that. So obviously, the pitfalls are obvious, and we'll talk more about that. So Waterfall is a more kind of a traditional, software development methodology where you kind of do all of your, design up front, right? Then you do all your development up front, all the testing. So it's all very sequential, and in an agile, that's something that certainly software development teams have been doing for many, many years now. It's really sort of the same as Waterfall, except for you're kind of breaking it up into these sprints, right? So you're doing all three, but on smaller set of changes iteratively, right? So you would do a little bit of design, implementation, testing, and then you would pick a next set of changes and you do design, implementation, testing.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll discuss it in the subsequent slides, the advantages of each.
All right, we're gonna see who's still out there in the audience. Gonna launch another poll here, just to see where people kind of self-assess before we get into pros and cons and kind of how to implement more sophisticated. Tara, Cullen, how would you categorize your release management methodology?
Well, right now we are refining our agile approach. I definitely have used every one of these methodologies in my time at SPS, and we are really benefiting from working in sprints. So we have a 2-week sprint interval, and we do use that iterative approach. And our next step is really to look towards version control and using scratch orgs, so that we can take it to the next level. I think that's so important in the agile space.
Yeah, and it looks like we've got a good mix of, some agile, some waterfall, some one-off out in the audience. So hopefully there's some tips and best practices you can take away today and improve those processes wherever you're at, because it's, there's not necessarily one right answer for everyone. It's more of a where are you at, what works for you. All right, digging into pros and cons, our first methodology is obviously this one-off, sometimes like change that deployment or development. Max, why would someone choose this methodology?
Well, it's easy. Obviously, that's sort of the default, right? And I said, a lot of times, and I've seen this, interestingly enough, sort of with increasing frequency in my time at Salesforce and in the ecosystem in general, is I see a lot of companies now doing what the best called a greenfield org strategies, which is basically they're re-implementing Salesforce in a brand new org, starting fresh. And I would say there's a number of reasons why that happens, but really, I think a key reason for that is that they, for whatever reason, maybe they were, really a small startup when they started with Salesforce 5 to 10 years, whatever it is ago, or maybe Salesforce was owned by, a sales team and was an enterprise-wide platform back then. Whatever the reasons, they sort of started with this one-off methodology, and that tends to sort of accumulate and build up a lot of technical debt. And that's why they're sort of starting fresh now. And so that's sort of the downside of it. Long-term downside is I think this tends to kind of create a free-for-all Wild West sort of environment that could lead to technical debt and problems down the road. But more immediately, obviously, you're sort of leveraging a full sandbox, and those can be quite expensive. So you're really not optimizing your Salesforce spend well. There's a high risk of kind of running into each other's work because everybody's working in the same environment, right? And then, the tools that come with Salesforce out of the box are limited in terms of the efficiency and the productivity that you can gain from them. One of them, sort of, Cullen, you hit on is, Salesforce does have this change sets functionality, which is designed to help you deploy metadata changes, but there's, you can argue kind of how effective that is, and there's definitely some problems with that, but at least there's something. But for data that drives an increasing number of apps on Salesforce platform, there's no change set at all. So you kind of end up doing that manually using the data loader and spreadsheets, or rekeying changes from sandbox to production. Both of those obviously very, very tedious, inefficient, and error prone.
Yeah. So, if you're at least developing in a sandbox first and then using change sets to promote, and maybe data loader to promote to production, that's better than just going direct into production. But I think these methodologies are really where we'd advise companies to think about getting to.
You bet. Yeah.
And I think a lot of companies kind of struggle with how do you do that. And so when you're starting to consider moving to more of a waterfall, what are some of the quick benefits that customers can realize and should expect?
So the key advantage of Waterfall obviously is the fact that you now have these deliberate steps of planning and design, which I think goes a long way towards solving that technical debt problem, right? So it's not a haphazard development anymore. It's a much more structured approach. You are giving some thought to design, hopefully the long-term implications of what you're doing and how this change is going to play into the next change, into the next 5 changes, etc., versus just focusing on the immediate term. Presumably with this model, you also have a more sophisticated org landscape where you do spin up different sandboxes for your developers and different work streams. So the risk of overwrites gets minimized, and obviously on balance it's better than haphazard one-off changes, but there's still some problems, which is waiting till the very end to do the testing and put the functionality in front of the users, right? So if you inaccurately interpreted the requirements, or the implementation missed the mark, or there was some kind of a bug, you don't uncover it until the very end, at which point it may be too late to make changes.
Yeah, and that kind of big bang release where you build up a bunch of changes, it just makes each of those releases this more risky affair where especially towards the end, you don't know what you're going to find isn't built right, or if the requirements changed. So it kind of creates this culture that is, kind of adverse to risk and really skeptical of releases are these big efforts. We want to keep them very tightly controlled versus more of an agile methodology, which kind of starts to change that thinking around how releases should work. Some of the innovation stuff that Cullen hit on earlier.
You bet. It gives you more freedom to innovate, and because the cost of a mistake is not as high. So that's absolutely right.
How about we hit on some of these other pros, benefits to agile outside of just kind of the culture shift and our stance on innovation?
Yeah, and so obviously agile is sort of I think the ultimate evolution. It's been used in software development, like software engineers have been using this for, years, decades, in fact. Um, I think it sort of does combine the best of both worlds. It gives you that agility and that freedom, that speed that one-off methodology does, while also preserving the sanity and the deliberateness of the waterfall model. And really, I mean, the best way to think about agile is just it's kind of waterfall, but broken up into multiple iterations. So you're going through the same steps, but you're going through those same steps on a smaller set of changes on a smaller scope, so that the impact of potential mistakes is less. And you can incorporate the feedback from a previous set of changes onto your next sprint, onto your next iteration.
Yeah, and it's not just the impact is less of each, but you're delivering features much faster as well. That's not to say Agile's perfect, and there's definitely some challenges implementing it within the Salesforce landscape. Can you talk a little bit about those, Max, and just what people should be prepared for as they try to adopt Agile?
Yeah, so because agile increases the velocity of changes, which is sort of the idea, but it does have the side effect that it does raise the overhead, right? Because now you're doing sort of these, whereas before you might have done one release, now you're essentially doing potentially dozens of smaller releases within that time frame, but there's obviously still some overhead with each one of them. So overall, that overhead grows. So it becomes really, really important to bring in tooling to help automate that, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the best practices. But it also does require, a mindset shift. There's a little bit of a culture change, and so you have to really think about delivering shippable functionality in the set time frame. You have to get good about breaking up the stories into smaller chunks, into something that's more manageable. And while software engineers are certainly used to this and have been doing this for many, 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 many years and decades, it may be tougher to get kind of your business and non-technical folks on board here, because that is something that's unfamiliar. Although interestingly enough, I do see Agile being adopted to like well outside of the kind of IT space to all kinds of business, even business teams, right? They're sort of breaking up the work into sprints. Like we're marketing, right? Kelly, you know this. We're doing some of this at Prodly, where we're breaking up the marketing projects, marketing work into sprints. So I think there is some sort of tailwind here in terms of just Agile getting more attention from all kinds of fields, not just software development or Salesforce administration.
Yeah, and I know on a personal level, as we've tried to adopt Agile to kind of run marketing that way, it's been a learning process. So some of these tips and tricks are applicable even outside of just managing Salesforce day to day. So our first best practice is defining an org management strategy. You can't figure out how to improve unless you kind of know where you're at and what you have to work with. So what advice do you have, Max, for defining that kind of org management release path strategy?
So the key is really to fully leverage, so in the Salesforce context, the key is to fully leverage all the different kinds of sandboxes that Salesforce gives you. So a very important concept is to isolate the changes into, like I would say, even on a story basis, right? So almost spin up a separate dev box or separate scratch org for a story or a set of changes, whatever that unit is. So not only just for individual people, right, but you kind of based on story. So the changes are to a particular piece of functionality are isolated in a given environment. And then put in place the promotion process, right? So figure out kind of what your pipeline, quote unquote, of CI/CD is. If you have a UAT sandbox, great. So that probably would be a full or partial copy sandbox. Customers often have, staging or SIT, system integration testing. So that kind of gives you, figure out what that progression looks like for you, and then use the right type of sandbox for the org.
Mm-hmm. So we have an example release path here, and you hit on kind of starting in a Scratch org or a dev org, and then leveraging different types of sandboxes appropriately. If, for this common kind of example, what kind of orgs would you recommend kind of at each of these phases?
Yeah, so the dev sandboxes you see on the left, that would probably be your dev or config only or dev pro sandboxes, or it depends a little bit on what you have. The key there, of course, is to make sure that you see that with the data that developers or admins. This isn't just for developers. I think it's very important in the context of this discussion, even though they're called developer sandboxes. We use the term loosely. So a declarative or admin making declarative changes in this for the purposes of this discussion is the same as a developer. So you would spin up one of these sandboxes for all of your virtuous stories, and the key, of course, is to seed it with the right kind of data that that whoever is making these changes needs to not only make them but also test them. Next up, you would promote it to QA or UAT. So in this diagram, it's sort of a partial copy sandbox. So it has a lot more of the data, but not necessarily all of it. And then once you sort of test out the changes there, and this is really what you're doing here, is testing out the integration changes, right? So as the different work streams merge together, you're testing out to make sure that they don't break, that the changes made for story A don't break the changes made for story B, and vice versa. And then you're kind of moving it up to the staging, which is a full copy sandbox, has all the data. So really this is, at the closest copy of production you can get. Obviously those you can only refresh monthly, so it's not going to be exactly like production, but that's as best as you can do. And there you would obviously give your access, potentially to users, broader set of users. You could also be testing out your integrations with other business systems in your landscape. So it really is a full-on testing before you promote to production.
Mm-hmm. And the thing, seeing it laid out like this, I think that's super interesting, is you start with your least costly but most frequent ability to refresh. And as you move closer to production, obviously a partial is less expensive than a full, but it can be refreshed slightly more frequently. So that kind of alignment from an org strategy works as well, really well. Tara or Cullen, how do you guys think about this? What's your release path look like? Is it different than this? Does it follow similarly?
So at SPS, we actually have 3 separate Salesforce admin teams, 4 almost. I won't get into the details of that. Each of us uses a slightly different approach. And the reason that I call that out is that when we rolled out CPQ, no one was using the partial org, and we adopted it as our own. So we actually use or jump right in and are developing in partial, because none of the other admin teams are using that. They're moving from dev orgs to the full copy through to production, and we use the partial copy where we initially test and develop before deploying through the full sandbox to make sure that's our last proof of concept against full records and what should be the most accurate global configuration. Mm-hmm. And then we deploy up through to production.
Yeah, so just to show, like, there's no right one way to do this. It's about, well, taking advantage of tools that weren't being used in your case and finding the right path for each team. I think the second thing we've got here is really a process and figuring out that process for new feature requests. So equally as important as how work is going to flow through your release cycle is how are you going to take on new work and how do you deal with stuff that's entering the pipeline, if you will. So Max, maybe you can share a bit more about things to think about in terms of building out a process for future intake.
Yeah, I think the key here is, like, frankly, I've seen lots of different ways to do it. Some teams use Jira, some teams often use cases in Salesforce or an create an internal record type for to surface change requests. We had probably built a custom object. There's lots of tools out there. I think what's more important is that you have a good, reliable process that is repeatable and that's well understood. And that prioritizes features in the right way, right? So obviously there's a number of dimensions to prioritization, impact on business, potentially severity if it's a bug. So I think what's less important is sort of how you do it, but what's more important is that it's consistent and that people understand, everybody, all the stakeholders understand how it works, so that there's no contention around why something is getting done or not getting done. Sort of all that is transparent and visible to everyone and well understood by everyone.
I think this is one of the first steps admin teams can take to kind of counteract that order taking mentality within a company, where it's just like, I'm going to throw something over the wall and they're going to work on it immediately. Like, no, we have a process. You're not our only stakeholder we're serving. So we're going to assess all of these and plan for it and be more diligent so that we're working on what's most important to the business. I think this is a super critical part to being able to get out of that order taking mentality. Tara, how does your team intake new work, prioritize that? How involved is your business, your stakeholders in that prioritization effort?
We do use a custom object in Salesforce as one of the methods, but of course, we also have emails and meetings and things that result in new requests. But what we stand on, and really to what Max was saying, is that we have a very structured process for obtaining information about the request. So who's requesting it? How does it align to SPS's strategic priorities? And what is the impact? So we collect that up front. And then on our team, we actually follow a very specific protocol around requirements gathering, scoping, building, and we use that to be able to speak back to our stakeholders or the requester and really be able to communicate our timelines and when we will be able to deliver, which then gives them some control to help us prioritize. When we have multiple requests coming from a single business unit, we can turn around and provide summaries of the requests, what it will take to complete them in a consistent manner, and allow them some input on how they would like to see those prioritized if we do have a conflict.
And you hit on, well, one of our future points. We'll get to the communication side of things in a minute. We've talked about sprints a little bit so far. Obviously, this is a very different way of working than kind of doing big bang releases. Max, what do you see as kind of the key advantages of working in sprints, and do you have any advice on timeframes for as you start to move work this way?
Yeah, so I mean the key benefits were already sort of hit on a little bit, right? Doing work in smaller chunks makes it more predictable. It reduces the risk of missing the mark by getting the features to users for users review faster. And I think really it's more predictable, and you're going to get into this cadence where you're just cranking out stuff, and then you can sort of measure, you can put some metrics around to measure your velocity and things like this. And because the sprints are the same length, and what that length is, we'll talk about in a second, because they're the same length, right? You're sort of comparing apples to apples. And if you shipped X number of story points or X amount of features in these 2 weeks, and you ship more in the next 2 weeks, then you're becoming more productive. If you did less, you're becoming less productive. So it really becomes possible to measure, and as we said, you can improve what you can measure. So it's a key stepping stone to being able to improve things. Mm-hmm. In terms of sort of the time frame, like what does that what is that? What's the right length for the sprint? I've seen everything from as low as a week to 3 to 4 weeks. And there's no right answer. I think the key is to find what works for you. And again, the real key is that they're the same, right? You're not going to do 1 week sprint and then 2 week sprint and 3 week sprint. So whatever the number is, pick the right number for you, but then you do them. They're all the same length, and so that predictability, that process is what really the most important thing. It's not how long the sprint is.
It's the predictability, definitely. Cullen, you mentioned earlier you guys are working on weekly sprints. I imagine there's some projects that just can't be completed in a week. So how do you guys think about breaking down work into what can fit in a sprint, so that you can stay focused on that incremental improvement?
Yeah, so actually we do 2 week sprints, but weekly deployments.
Sorry.
So slight nuance there, just to keep the ball moving. Our team's project manager has been really fleshing out the process for how our sprints are planned. And for instance, during this sprint, we have a big legacy contract initiative going on right now. That's not going to be completed in a single sprint, obviously, but it needs to keep getting incrementally pushed forward. So let's say a fourth of my sprint will be set to that long-term initiative. I'll also be assigned enhancements from product managers or other stakeholders that is more actionable and can keep those small, like, micro enhancements going into our production org, and sort of in the spirit of agile development. And then it's also on me to look forward and see, well, I have my individual goals. Let's make sure I get a ticket into a future sprint so that I can work on whether it's building out a cool flow or enhancing the data integrity around a certain process, whatever it might be. It's kind of those smaller, actionable mixed in with the long-term bite-sized pieces of a larger project plan.
Great. So communication, we hit on it a little bit earlier. I think this is super critical and can be overlooked because it's not a tool. It's really not. It's more process and people based. Max, what do you see as kind of being critical for communication, especially, like, you got to realize this is a change of work for how an admin team works, but also a change for the stakeholders who are consuming the benefits of those work.
Yeah, I always think communication is key, and I think it kind of breaks down into two parts. One is communication and transparency around the intake and prioritization process, right? So here's how you enter your change request. You don't knock on the door of Tara and say, Tara, do this. You go to Salesforce and you create a record in the custom object that represents the change, and here are the criteria that we use, and we'll have a cross-functional team that prioritizes them, and you'll have a voice on that team. But there's a process around that, so that's one key part of it. And then, of course, on the other end is you've got to make sure that the communication around the changes that actually were implemented is also put in place. So this is where automation becomes really important, right? If you can track what changes were made for which story, right, and what was actually released, then you can sort of automate. You don't necessarily need release notes necessarily, but kind of the same concept that you'd have in product development, right? Release notes, something like here's our release, and here's the changes. Here are the change requests that were fulfilled in this release.
And Tara, you hit on earlier how your team's partnership with the broader business has improved over time. What's your communication strategy with them? Has that evolved as you've kind of grown that better partnership?
It has evolved, completely from, day one when we had no process in place. It was hard to say what it would take to get something done, when we could start, and when we would expect it to be finished. So I touched on that, already around how our defined process allows us to communicate, and really that builds solid relationships. But another way that we communicate around within the organization is to the sales team, which is generally our end user customer, they're consuming, what product management or finance, et cetera, what changes they request. And so we also work really closely with our internal sales training team and have regularly scheduled communication to update the sales team on what changes we've made, and we post that to a dedicated web page, on a shared site, so that users can go back and look and see when certain changes were made and key details about those. So not only with the requesters, but also with our customers, we've been able to communicate more clearly and more consistently what's happening with CPQ.
Awesome. Max kind of alluded to this, automate everything possible. Where should admins look to start with automation? Because obviously this way of working only works effectively if you're not spending 50% of your sprint time on just kind of the administrative parts of managing a release and getting started, but if you got to have the majority of your time actually making those changes.
Yeah, so obviously the most obvious place, the first place to start would be, automating sort of the deployments. There's kind of two major components to the deployments, certainly in Salesforce world, that's metadata and data. Metadata, there's some built-in tools in Salesforce like we talked about, like change management, change sets that sort of kind of automate this. There's still a very kind of manual, tedious process of adding your metadata artifacts to the change set. So the next step after that would be potentially do some tooling around like Salesforce DX. There's also a bunch of vendors providing solutions to help automate this. There's some open source. We've seen a bunch of customers that have implemented sort of a CI/CD process in the back of open source tools like Jenkins. Those are designed primarily for developers, and code, but obviously it could work for metadata as well. And then on the data side, obviously data loader is better than making changes manually, but depending on the volume of changes you're making and the type of the type of data that you're moving, you may need to look into some tooling as well. And also, I think what's key, and that's kind of how we look at this, right? It's a holistic process, not just about deployments, but there's also testing. Obviously, there's unit testing, which presumably everybody's doing as they're making changes. But then there's regression testing, right? So you made the change, it'll work, but did it break something else? So are you doing this, in the rigorous, do you have some rigor on that around your release management process? So that's also very important to consider.
Now, Tara, you've made it an actual team goal to be fully automated in 2020 for the data migration deployment side with Prodly, of course. So first off, how are you doing with that goal, and why was that such a priority for you and your team?
Well, we are knocking it out of the park, thanks to a lot of hard work from Cullen and the amazing partnership that we've had with Prodly, especially our CSM, Andy Slania. I mean, we get so responsive and so helpful, and so we're exceeding our goal. We're fully automated in terms of our deployments, and we're actually, I think we'll talk about this in a bit, looking at what are the ways that we can incorporate some of the new releases Prodly has into our plan. But it was such a priority because I knew the pain of data loader, our team did, of trying to use data loader, of having or manual processes, and it's just not scalable with Salesforce CPQ. You need the automation. And so there was no question that there was a value to the service that Prodly provided. But I will say that when we first purchased the tool, I did underestimate how powerful it was. And when you're using something so powerful, it does take a little bit more time to really learn and hone your skill with it. And so that's why we made it a specific priority, because we knew how valuable it would be to our team, and that to use it effectively and really see the results that we wanted, we needed to become experts.
Well, it's great to hear that you've made this journey, you're very comfortable with the tool now, and it's really helping deliver value for your team. Cullen, I know you've been starting to think about regression testing and have been playing around with our latest product release AppOps test. How's that going? How do you think about testing? What kind of impact do you think automating more of that side, now that you've kind of tackled the deployment side, can have for you?
Yeah, so I mentioned those different buckets of work earlier. And, you know, in the spirit of trying to free up more of our team's time to do those exciting enhancements and those personal projects, the next big mountain is the time we spend testing. We're very visible because we're fortunate to be a part of some big strategic initiatives this year. So we have a really small appetite for mistakes, and we, you know, unintended breaks and downtime are just things that we can't stomach right now. So it's important that we test thoroughly. And so a huge part of our sprint planning goes towards members of our team performing manual regression testing in our partial org, and then once we promote, in our test org, and then when we deploy to production, then signing on early and doing a gut check, a peace of mind round of testing in production. It's just a huge part of our sprints right now. And so we can see how a regression testing tool is going to free us up even further to take on those strategic initiatives, to go out and be proactive within the organization, meet with teams that are having painful experiences with CPQ adjacent objects, things like that, and really seeing what we can do for them. So that's exciting. It
is, and it doesn't do a whole lot of good to be able to build and come up with these new features and get those through if it all gets bottlenecked at the testing part, because the end goal is get new functionality into users' hands as quickly as possible. So it's a key last kind of part of your sprint to cover off on. Okay, so up until now, these have all been topics that anyone can do regardless of their methodology. This gets a little more into a more sophisticated agile approach, but tracking is important. So there are obviously other ways, spreadsheets, taking notes, wiki pages, all that, but that's not really what we're talking about here, is it, Max? It's more, how do you automate the tracking component of this as well?
Yeah, and so, and I would say this is less tied to Agile. You can certainly do this with Waterfall, and in fact, version control systems is something that's been a part of software engineering landscape for decades. The key is that you track who did what and when, and hopefully why. So that ties to the change request process. And there's really two main benefits. One is the obvious, right? It's that audit trail. And so when, you know, if you're certainly a publicly traded company, or you're subject to other regulatory constraints, then being able to show why the changes were made, by whom, and when is very important. The other part that's less obvious is that gives you the rollback functionality, or rollback capability. So if should something go wrong, God forbid, you want to go back to the last release and figure out what went wrong, where the bug was in your sandbox, right, and not scramble to fix a bug in production while your mission critical system like CPQ is down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to Cullen's earlier point, downtime is not good, and when you do have inadvertent impacts, you know, something missing, broken, it is fairly difficult in the Salesforce ecosystem to revert those changes. You know, sometimes it's a fire drill, or everybody scrambling to figure out where that mistake happened.
Particularly with data, yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, so for those out there in the audience, we are taking questions. You can enter them in the question box in the GoToWebinar tool there. If you want to pick Max's brain or Tara or Cullen's for the remaining of the webinar. Max, this is obviously a passion for you, change management. It's also the platform we are trying to build at Prodly. Can you share a bit more about AppOps and our vision for Salesforce and for admins?
Yeah, for sure. So this has been a passion of mine. I think in some ways this is an extension of what I started to do at Steelbrick. I'm passionate about making complex things simple, democratize enterprise software implementations and maintenance. And so Prodly AppOps really stands for application operations. It's a comprehensive platform to make non-technical resources more productive and provide them with an easy but powerful and compliant way to manage, to deploy and maintain these low-code applications. Right, the world is going to low-code. So obviously Salesforce platform and all the apps is a great example of that. And so the key aspect of a low code is that it's configured primarily with clicks, not code, right? There's some code, but there's a lot of clicks, a lot of configuration. And that's the missing part, right? You have a whole slew of vendors providing DevOps solutions, but that's really designed for code and developers. So we think the shift to low code warrants a new tool set that's designed for less technical users and really designed for the config, for the clicks of the drive these applications, which could be both metadata and data. Frankly, we're going to do both, but the key is the user and the type of workflows that we're going to support.
Great. Quick plug for anyone who has enjoyed the session and is interested in learning more, want to see a demo or explore how this could be impactful for your business. You can get a customized, personalized demo at prodly.co/get-demo. We do have one question from Fraser here. Let me expand it so I can read it. So Prodly has been long focused in the CPQ space for release management and transactional data. Are you looking to expand into the CI/CD space for broader Salesforce metadata deployment, CPQ deployment? Max, I know this is something we've been working on the whole time I've been here. Is obviously today we can do more than CPQ, and it's kind of just a perception issue. But do you want to talk a bit more about kind of future plans?
Yeah, sure. So I think I've sort of started to address that question a little bit. So we certainly started with deployment and CI/CD around config data, which drives declaratively configured apps like CPQ. We actually do support any application on Salesforce platform or that is configuration data driven today. Like I said, it has been a little bit of a perception issue. But I think the question does go to sort of our bigger plans. And yes, we are going to add support for metadata and support any kind of configuration, right? Whether it's data or metadata. But we are going to focus on these declarative configurations, right? So we're not going to focus on code-based customizations and supporting developers. Our whole reason for being in our vision is to build an equivalent to DevOps, but designed for the admin teams and declarative changes that they're making to Salesforce.
Great. And our final question before we have to sign off, I think this is more for Tara and Cullen. As an admin looking to improve our release management, it's been a challenge selling this idea internally. Do you have any advice for kind of getting stakeholder, business, executive buy-in for implementing better release management?
I would say that it's been a real process for us. It didn't happen overnight, and so I think you need to target what things you can control. That don't, start with the things that don't require your stakeholders buy-in. It starts with defining clearer processes on your team. We talked about how do you intake your work? How do you structure and organize how you're going to work through a project? And assigning points. If you're not familiar with Agile, just being able to think about how long it takes to do certain tasks that you're familiar with, and so that you can better plan your time. And what your stakeholders will see is that you're better able to communicate and deliver on what you've stated that you will do when you will do it. And it forms a natural buy-in that this release management is working. And hopefully that then would make it easier if you wanted to move to something more rigorous. For example, we don't have a specific day that we only do releases on. We are more flexible in that way, but some people prefer to get that structured and say we only do releases once a month on Friday, you know, the third Friday or whatnot. No, Friday would be a terrible day, but you've gained that momentum with your stakeholders to then drive a more rigor around your process.
Thank you. That's a great way to look at it. And yeah, it's just like an agile process, or just like the goal of better release management is incremental improvement. The same goes internally. So keep that in mind. Thank you, everyone. That's all our time. Thanks for the questions and engagement. Tara, Cullen, thank you so much for joining us and talking about release management.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.